I've listed for you here and on the future slides many of the functional categories of echolalia to help you in determining when your children are using echolalia. I'm not going to go through each one of these. I think they're fairly self-explanatory, but I will just kind of review them. Interactive echolalia has 4 different kinds. Turn-taking, where the utterance is just used as a turn filler. They know they're supposed to say something. They know that there's an alternating verbal exchange. Declarative functional echolalia is utterances labeling objects, actions, or locations. Yes answers, utterance used to indicate an affirmation of a prior utterance. Want a cookie? Yes. Things like that. Utterances used to request objects or other objects, usually involving mitigated echolalia. Mitigated echolalia means that I've changed it just a little bit. In fact, in my previous answer where I said want a cookie, yes, that would be kind of mitigated echolalia. So maybe the teacher goes, do you want a cookie? And the little kid goes, want a cookie? Yes. So they've changed something, they've added something of their own, so they've mitigated the echolalia. Non-interactive functional categories appear like the non-focused ones, utterances that really are produced with no apparent intent. Sometimes in states of really high arousal, they may use them to calm. So I see this a lot when children have trouble with transitions. The teacher may say, okay, now it's time for lunch, and you hear a little kid go, time for lunch, time for lunch, time for lunch, because they're worried about the transition or they don't like the noise in the cafeteria, things like that. Rehearsal, utterances using kind of as a processing aid to indicate that they've understood it, or repeating it to understand it. And then there's self-regulatory utterances, so utterances which serve to regulate their own actions, sometimes produced in synchrony with motor activity, just the kind of repetition that's calming. Delayed echolalia is the echoing of a phrase after some delay or lapse of time, and it taps into the long-term auditory memory. And really, I believe too that this is a really different phenomenon from immediate echolalia. I really see delayed echolalia frequently in children with autism, even children who have some quite complex language. I'll hear pieces of delayed echolalia or memorized kind of holistic chunks of language that I know they read a portion of a paragraph or they heard from a movie, and they're repeating it at an appropriate time and context, but kind of in a whole chunk. So we have interactive delayed echolalia, such as turn-taking, which we talked about with immediate echolalia. Verbal completion, utterances which complete familiar verbal routines initiated by others. We have providing information, utterances offering new information not apparent from the situational context. So this might be initiated by them or respondent from requests from others. And labeling, utterances labeling object or actions in the environment. Much like the example I think I gave you earlier when the little boy was going casual, no, causal, no, casual, an informal mode of attire. So he had read that in the dictionary and he was popping it back out at us. Certainly many of the typical uses of all of our communicative functions are found and used with delayed echolalia: protests, requests, calling, affirmation, directives. Delayed echolalia certainly also has non-interactive situations. You know, we've all heard children who repeat whole movies or repeat whole television shows, things like that. Non-focused delayed echolalia would be utterances with no apparent communicative intent or relevance. Maybe use self-stimulatory or self-soothing. Situation association, so utterance with no apparent communicative intent, but are triggered by an object, a person, a situation, or an activity. So sometimes you'll hear whole pieces of a movie or something like that that was triggered by a word or something that they saw. Many times, you know, you'll hear little pieces of something that you might not make that association, but they will. Self-directed is utterances that serve to regulate one's own actions. So if maybe a teacher has given them verbal directions with something, they may be repeating the teacher's verbal directions. Rehearsal, utterances produced in a low volume, followed by a louder interactive production, which appear to be practice for that production. You don't see that often, but you do see it every once in a while. Label, non-interactive, an utterance that's just labeling objects or actions in the environment with no apparent communicative intent, but they may be practicing learning new language at that point. So now let's move to intervention. With immediate echolalia, the prime focus is to teach a communicative response that is more appropriate but answers the same function, much as we did or talked about doing in positive behavior support, right? However, we need to diminish that automatic echolalic response pattern. And this is motor patterning. They get in the habit of just repeating what is said. And because of their motor planning issues and executive functioning issues, we have to teach them to inhibit that repetition, that motor planning of repetition, and to then stop that and then motor plan something new. So the focus in intervention is to break that automatic pattern and establish a conversational turn-taking pattern that involves them inhibiting the repetition and then starting to motor plan a new response. You can do it auditorily, and it works somewhat. It's not the most efficient, but you can. So for instance, I could say, what do you want? Cookie! What do you want? And so I've said cookie much louder, and hopefully what they'll repeat is cookie, but I've gotten in that conversational turn-taking. It takes a long time to do this and a lot of effort. I'd much rather use an object, a gesture, or a visual cue. Lots of times I'll use photographs or visual cues, so I may show them a picture of a cookie first before I ask the question, and then say, what do you want? And I'm pointing at the cookie, and they're more likely to say cookie, and I get that in. I don't use a gesture sign cue quite as much as I use a visual cue, just because it really promotes that kind of prompt dependency. They're looking for you to do the point or to do the whatever. So really be aware of what kind of prompts you're giving when you're doing it. So with delayed echolalia, intervention is again tied to function as it is with immediate echolalia. However, you're not working on inhibiting an automatic motor pattern. You're working on producing analytic language. So it's really important to send that message that anything said out loud is interpreted as communicative. So if they're repeating the Nemo movie, you may pull some of that content out and say, oh, Nemo, and they'll look really amazingly at you like, you're in here with me? I can't believe it. So really sending that message. I also use a lot of comic strip conversation symbols to show the difference between thinking and speaking, and I do a lot of work. You may want to work with your speech pathologist in getting them to be able to produce their own novel utterances.